Please subscribe for more. Bone, Book 2.
What do you mean the story gets more appalling?
Garaz was incredulous.
How in Bothia's name could it get more appalling?
It's a ruse.
Giomara scoffed, ordering 2 more mugs of grief and a glass of Flynn for Garaz.
How much worse can a tale get which prominently features cannibalism, abuse of slaves, and the regular placement of rotting animal carcasses?
Don't you dare me,
growled Halgerd, annoyed by his listener's lack of appreciation of his prose styling.
Remind me where we were.
Arslik Oan is the owner of a stronghold under siege by savage, cannibalistic Nords,
said Giomara, keeping a straight face.
After a lot of deaths and several unsuccessful attempts to get water, he had his armorer with the unlikely name of Gorkith outfit his slaves with the first ever Bonemold armor. One of them finally makes it back with some water.
It was only 1 jar full of water,
said Halgerd, pulling back in his chair and continuing the tale.
And Arslikon drank most of it, passing the remains to his dear armourer Gorkith, and the last dribbles to the few dozen slaves who still lived. It was hardly enough to sustain health and well-being. Another expedition was necessary, but they had only 1 suit of Bonemold left, as there was only 1 survivor of the trip. 1 out of 18 slaves made it through the gauntlet of Nords, wearing that marvellous Bonemold armour of yours, said Arslik Owen to Gorkith. And 1 can only carry back enough water for 1. Therefore, mathematically, as we have, counting you and me, 56 remaining people at the stronghold, we need armour for 54. Since we already have 1, you only need to make 53 to make the total. That way 3 will make it back, with enough water for you and me and whoever's in the best condition to partake. I don't know what we'll do after that, but if we wait, we won't have enough slaves to fetch even a couple days' worth of water. I understand, whimpered Gorkith, but how am I going to make the armour? I used all the livestock bones to make the first batch of Bonemold. Arslik Owen gave an order which Gorkith fearfully complied with. In 18 hours...
What do you mean Arslik Owen gave an order which Gorkith fearfully complied with?
Asked Giomara.
What was the order?
In 18 hours, Gorkith had 53 suits of bone mail, said Halgerd, continuing, not really minding the interruption, prepared for the slaves. Without prompting, he ordered the slaves to practice using the armour, and even allowed them more training time than their predecessors. They not only learned how to move and stop quickly in Bonemold, but how to adjust their peripheral vision, to see a blow before it came, and to sway to dodge, and where the sturdiest reinforcement points on the arm were, the centre of the chest and the abdomen, and how to position themselves to take blows there against their natural instincts. The slaves even had time for a mock battle before being sent out among the cannibals. The slaves handled themselves admirably. Very few, just 15 slaves, were killed and eaten outright. Only 10 were killed and eaten when they reached the river. That was when things did not go according to Arslik Oan's plans. 21 slaves with jars of water took off for the hills. Only 8 returned to the castle, largely because they were blocked by the cannibal Nords. It was a larger percentage than he had anticipated surviving, but Arslik Oan felt righteous indignation at the paucity of loyalty. "Are you absolutely certain you wouldn't rather flee?" he hollered from the battlements. Finally, he allowed the survivors in. 3 had been killed waiting for the gate to open. 2 more died almost upon stepping into the courtyard. 1 was delirious, walking around in circles, laughing and dancing before suddenly collapsing. That meant 5 jars of water for 4 people, the 2 surviving slaves, Arslik Oan and Gorkith. As the lord of the manor, Arslik Oan took the extra jar, but he was democratic with the others.
You're quite correct,
frowned Garaz.
This story is getting more and more appalling.
Just wait,
smiled Halgerd.
The next morning,
Halgerd continued.
Arslik Oan awoke to a perfectly still and quiet stronghold. There was no murmuring in the corridors, no sound of hard labor in the courtyard. He dressed and surveyed the scene. It appeared that the fortress was utterly deserted. Arslik Oan walked down to the armourer's quarters, but the door was locked. "Open up," said Arslik Oan patiently. "We need to speak. 30 out of 54 slaves successfully made it to the river and gathered water. Admittedly, some then fled, and a couple didn't survive because I needed to correct their fickleness, but mathematically that's a 55% survival rate. If you and I and the 2 remaining slaves made the next run to the river, we too should survive." "Zillion and Galo left last night with their armour," cried Gorklith through the door. "Who are Zillion and Galo?" "The 2 remaining slaves. They don't remain anymore." "Well, that's vexing," said Arslik Oan. "Still, we must continue on. Mathematically." "I heard something last night," whimpered Gorklith in a funny voice. "Like footsteps, only different, and they were moving through the walls, and there were voices too. They sounded strange, like they couldn't move their jaws very well, but I knew one." Arslik Oan sighed, humouring his poor armourer. "And who was it?" "Ponik." "And who is Ponik?" "One of the slaves that died when the Nords poisoned our water. One of the many, many slaves that died and we made use of. He was always a nice, uncomplaining fellow. That's why I noticed his voice above all the others." Gorklith began to sob. "I understood what he was saying." "Which was what?" asked Arslik Oan with a sigh. "Give me back my bones," Gorklith's voice shrieked. There was silence for a moment, and then more hysterical sobbing.
I saw that coming.
laughed Xiomara.
There was nothing more to be done with the armourer for the time being,
said Halgerd, a trifle annoyed at the regular interruptions.
So Arslik Oan stripped one of the dead slaves of his suit of Bonemold and put it on. He practiced in the courtyard, impressing himself with his natural, comfortably with medium-weight armour. For hours he boxed, feinted, dodged, sprinted, skipped, jumped, and generally cavorted about. When he felt tired, he retired to the shade and took a nap. The sound of the king's trumpet woke him with a start. Night had fallen, and for a moment he thought he had been dreaming. Then the alarm sounded again, far in the distance, but clear. Arslik Oan leapt to his feet and ran to the ramparts. Several miles away, he could see the emissaries and their vast and well-armed escort approach. They were there early. The cannibal Nords below looked at one another with consternation. Savages they might be, but they knew when a superior force was approaching. Arslik Oan joyously dashed down the stairs to Gorklith's chamber. The door was still locked. He beat on it, cajoling, demanding, threatening. Finally he found a key, one of the few scraps of metal that had not been smelted days before. Gorklith appeared to be sleeping, but as Arslik Oan approached, he noticed that the armourer's mouth and eyes were wide open, and his arms were folded unnaturally behind his back. On closer inspection, the armourer was obviously dead. What was more, his face and whole body were sunken like an empty pig's bladder. Something moved through the walls like a footfall, only squishy. Arslik Oan expertly and gracefully turned to face it, completely in balance. At first it seemed like nothing more than a bubble expanding through one of the cracks in the stone. As more of the flesh-coloured gelatinous matter emerged, it more clearly resembled part of a face. A flaccid, almost shapeless face, with a low brow and a slack, toothless jaw. The rest of the body oozed out of the crack, a soft bag of muscle and blood. Behind Arslik Oan and to the side, there was more movement, more slaves welling up through the cracks in the stone. They were all around him, reaching out. "Give us," moaned Ponik, his tongue rolling about his hanging jaw. "Give us back our bones." Arslik Oan began to rip off his bone mold, throwing it to the floor. 100 figures, more, pooled into the small chamber. That's not enough. The cannibals had cleared away by the time the king's emissaries arrived at Arslik Oan's gates. They had not been looking forward to this visit. It was best, they thought philosophically, to begin with the worst of the king's noblemen, so to end their trip well. They sounded the alarm once again, but the gates did not open. There was no sound from Arslik Oan's stronghold. It took a few hours to gain access. If the emissaries had not brought a professional acrobat with them for entertainment, it might have taken longer. The place seemed to be abandoned. They searched every room, until finally they came to the armourer's. There they found the master of the manor, folded neatly, legs behind his head, arms behind the legs, like a fine gown. Not a bone in his body.
The first part of your story was complete nonsense.
cried Xiomara.
But now it doesn't hold true on any level. How could Bonemold be made again if the armorer who invented it died before he could tell anyone how he did it?
I said that this was the first time it was created, not the first time people learned the craft.
And when did someone first teach someone else the craft?
asked Garaz.
That, my friends,
Replied Halgerd with a sinister smile.
is a tale for another night.
The end.